I'll invite you at this time to turn to the book of Nehemiah. We'll look at Nehemiah chapter 2. Now, I usually preach with the help of this equipment here, and I do have a PowerPoint prepared for this somewhere. I don't know how I was helping my dad, and it was about 1 in the morning, I think, when I saved this, and where it went, I don't know, but it'll show up someday. But as I prepared that PowerPoint, most of it simply comes from this text. So you can look down and follow me in the scriptures and pretty much see what I'm going to put up on the PowerPoint anyway. A couple of things I didn't put there, and I'll describe those to you, and we'll continue this story of Nehemiah. We begin this morning when Nehemiah's brother comes from Jerusalem, and he asks, "How is Jerusalem? How are things there?" He says, "The people, they're desolate. And the walls of the city are torn down, and the gates are burned with fire." And that grieved Nehemiah. And so Nehemiah prayed this prayer. And we spent the morning looking at that prayer Nehemiah prayed as a model prayer on how we ought to pray. And at the end of that prayer, in verse 11, Nehemiah says, "O Lord, I beseech thee now, let thine ear be attentive unto the prayer of thy servant, and to the prayer of thy servants, who desire to fear thy name, and prosper, I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." Well, that man is the king, Artaxerxes. Nehemiah wants to go before Artaxerxes and present his case and say, "Let me go to Jerusalem and help them and get them organized so we can rebuild the walls of that city." And so Nehemiah prayed night and day for 4 months, awaiting that opportunity when the time would be right to present that case before the king. And then the last few words of chapter 11 bring us to chapter 2. It says, "For I was the king's cupbearer." It says, for I was the king's cupbearer. If you had a king and you didn't like, what did you do? How did you get rid of a king? Well, you couldn't impeach him. That's what we try to do, you know. We got a president we don't like. Well, let's just impeach him and get rid of him. No, you couldn't do that. These kings, they didn't come up for re-election. They inherited this. How do you get rid of that king? Well, the way you get rid of a king is you kill him. Now, how are you going to kill a king? I mean, we've got our Secret Service around our president. What do they do to get rid of a king? He'll have his guards around him. He'll be the most protected man in all the Persian kingdom. Well, the way they get rid of some kings in those days, they could poison them. And then they wouldn't even know really who it was that put him to death, would they? That'd get rid of that king. So what does the king do? Well, he gets a cupbearer. Now, that's not just the man that brings his cup from the kitchen. He's not just bringing him a cup of coffee now. The cupbearer had great responsibility to see to it that the king had the right kind of food and that it would be safe to eat. I tell you, the king had to trust his cupbearer. Something else about a cupbearer. He's sitting down and eating with the king. You see, the king knows that this is going to be safe. The cupbearer's eating that meatloaf. If he's going to eat it, I can eat the meatloaf too, you know. So he would watch what the cupbearer ate, and as the cupbearer would eat, so the king would eat, and that'd keep the king safe. But to be able to sit down and eat with someone and have their meals with them, you'd naturally have a rapport with them. Being the king's cupbearer meant you had an intimate relationship with that king that was different than maybe those officials that he would appoint over provinces and such as that. You'd be the king's friend and a trusted friend of the king. And so Nehemiah knew, I'm in a position where if the opportunity presents itself, I'll be able to make request of the king. And he's praying to God that the king would show Nehemiah that mercy he'll be asking for when he goes to the king in behalf of his people. And I relate this very closely to Esther going before King Ahasuerus on behalf of her people. Nehemiah in somewhat the same position. And so we come to Nehemiah chapter 2. Now there's a lot going to happen in this, and we're going to be far, far into the story at the end of this chapter. And I want to present it to you in 4 scenes. Think about 4 different scenes. Maybe the curtain closed and the curtain opened, and you're going to go from scene 1 to scene 2, scene 3, and scene 4. Scene 1 is Nehemiah with King Artaxerxes. Let's see how it begins. It's 8 verses here. It says, it came to pass in the month Nisan. Now, we talked about that being around our March, April time of the year. In the 12th year of Artaxerxes, that means he'd been king for 12 years, that wine was before him. And I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now, I had not been beforehand sad in his presence. Whereof the king said unto me, why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but the sorrow of heart. And then I was very sore afraid. You see, you've done that with people you've worked with, haven't you? You work with them day by day, and then someday you just know something's not right. Something's wrong there. And if you have a relationship with that co-worker or someone you know, maybe it's someone you supervise, and you say, something's bothering you today. And sure enough, it'll come out, oh, there's this terrible problem going on in their lives. And so that kind of shows the relationship they had that the king recognized. He says, now he's not sick. If he's sick, he'd worry about it, about the food, you see. So I know he's not sick. Well, this is a sorrow of heart. And when Nehemiah knew that the king had spotted this in him, he was afraid. Now, why would he be fearful? Well, I tell you, the kings in those days had pretty much absolute power. And the king he wanted someone, he didn't want to sit here and eat with grief. Someone wanted cheerful when he's eating with him. And maybe he thought, well, I am at risk here, but there's something else maybe. If you go back to the book of Ezra, chapter 4, and verse 21, we're reading about a king named Artaxerxes. Now, there was at least 3 kings named Artaxerxes, and I get these confused, but I think this is an earlier king. And this king Artaxerxes, during the days of Ezra, had made a decree that they would stop working on the walls of Jerusalem. And we know from the other stories of the laws of the Medes and the Persians, when the king spake, that was it. It didn't change. And now here is Nehemiah going before a king, another Persian king, and he's wanting him to reverse that decree. Well, that's a fearful thing to do as well. He doesn't want this to mess up. He'd been praying 4 months for this, and now he knows this is the time, and I want this to go right. And so he's going to present his case to Artaxerxes. It is interesting. If you'll go back and read that in Ezra 4 and verse 21, that it says in that very verse that they would stop working on the walls unless they heard from the king. So he kind of gave himself a little out there to change his mind later, didn't he? So here we go. In verse 3, I said to the king, let the king live forever. So he's addressing the king with great respect. He says, why should not my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? Notice that expression. the place of my father's sepulchres. That was his heritage. And the commentaries tell us that according to the culture of those Persians, that there was great respect given to their heritage and to their fathers. And so this would make this, even though Nehemiah himself may never himself had been at Jerusalem, this would impress upon the king the significance of Jerusalem to him. And so, the king says in verse 4, "For what dost thou make request?" And look what Nehemiah did. "I prayed to the God of heaven." He had been praying for months. And I don't know that he got down on his knees and folded his hands and worded a prayer at that time, but I tell you, you can pray right inside your heart. You can pray right now during this sermon, and no one else know it, but you know you're praying. And so here I go. I've been working on this 4 months now, and this is the time. And so just before he makes that request, he's making that prayer. And he says to the king, verse 5, "If it please the king, and if thy servants have found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me to Judah unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. And the king said unto me," the queen also sitting by him, isn't that interesting? Sitting there together. And here's what they say, "For how long shall thy journey be? And when wilt thou return?" So it pleased the king to send me. And I set him a time. Moreover, I said to the king, "If it please the king, let letters be given to me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over until I come to Judah. And a letter unto Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace which appeareth in the house, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall enter into. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me." I remember a lady in North Carolina that would worry a lot. And when things would work out, she'd sometimes say, "Well, all that worrying paid off." And we shouldn't be worrying, we should be praying. I think we could say with Nehemiah here, all that praying paid off. God's hand was upon him. And though he acknowledged that the king had granted his request, I want you to also see how he acknowledged the hand of God in this. The unseen, providential hand of God working things out for Nehemiah. And the request in the meeting couldn't have come off any better than it did, could it? So with that, we'll close scene 1. Let's go to scene 2. Scene 2 is about the journey he makes from Shushan, the palace, unto Jerusalem. Well, I had a map I was going to show you where Shushan, the palace, was in Jerusalem and the route probably taken. There's a map in your Bible. If you got a Pew Bible, I checked the Pew Bible that I have up here. They all look kind of the same. Look at the back of the Pew Bible, or look in the back of your Bible, and find a map that shows the Persian Gulf. Now you'll see there'll be the Red Sea, and then there'll be the Persian Gulf. And then go to the Persian Gulf, and then go due north of the Persian Gulf, and you'll either find a little city there named Shushan or Susa, S-U-S-A. It's another name for Shushan. That's where Nehemiah was with the king. And then you can see how he would make his journey up the Tigris and Euphrates River. When Abraham made a trip similar from Ur, he went to Haran and then down. And so it would be a journey of several months across those desert lands, and keeping away from the deep desert and following those rivers up and making his way. And he would pass through several of the provinces on his way. The king sent soldiers with him that would accompany him, and he would have letters from the king himself saying, "You let this man go through, And I want you to support him in this mission that I've sent him on. And so we read, Nehemiah chapter 9 through 11 tells us about that journey. Then I came to the governors beyond the rivers and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant of the Ammonite heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that thou wast come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. This Sanballat and this Tobiah were men in some position of authority over that country and around Jerusalem, and they didn't want to see the children of Israel prosper there again. They were the foreigners, and we're going to read more about them and the opposition that they're going to bring to Nehemiah as we continue. But after making that long journey, Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem. It sounds like he's got to recuperate. And so after about 3 days, Nehemiah starts in on his work there. In the next scene, we have a night ride around Jerusalem. Perhaps Nehemiah is the original midnight rider. He's going to go unseen, and except for just a few men, see for himself the condition of these walls. And he goes at night and sees just what a task lies before him. Here we have it in verses 12 through 16. And I arose in the night, I and some few men with me. Neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. Neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. And I went out by night at the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, and to the dung part, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire. Then went I on to the gate of the fountain and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass. Then went I up by night by the brook and viewed the wall, and turned back and entered the gate of the valley, and so returned. And the rulers knew not whither I went or what I did, neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest of them that did the work. So first he makes his own survey. Some of the places where he went were so desolate and broken that he couldn't get over that part with his beast. Turned and went around the other way and came back in and came and saw what a great task was before him. Scene 4. This scene must have been as tense as that meeting with the king. He wanted everything to come out right. And now he's going to make his case before the people of Jerusalem and for those that were in authority with them to say, let's rebuild their walls. And would they be willing to take this on? Let's begin in verse 17. Then I said unto them, ye see the distress that we're in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Then I told them that the hand of my God, which was good upon me, and also the king's words that he had spoken to me, and they said, and I'm going to mark this in my Bible, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. Oh, how that must have thrilled Nehemiah to hear those words. And they didn't say, yeah, Nehemiah, that sounds like a good plan. Maybe you can get somebody to do that. Well, Nehemiah, go ahead. It's your idea. You just take the lead and go get it done and let us know how you're doing. No. They said, let us rise up and build. The rulers there in Jerusalem, the men he were talking to, were ready to accept responsibility for that work and be part of it and get that work done. You know, that's how the work gets done in the Lord's church. So, well, we got a preacher, we'll let him do it. Or we got elders, we'll let the elders do the work. Or maybe we ought to appoint deacons and let them take care of everything. But no, it's this attitude of let us do that. We'll do what we can do. We're going to do this work together. But everyone is not happy when they find out that these walls are going to be built. Remember Sanballat and Tobiah? Verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Gershom the Arabian heard of it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, what thing is this that you will do? Will you rebel against the king? Then answered I unto them and said unto them, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build, but ye have no portion nor right nor memorial in Jerusalem. Well, they ridiculed them. What do you think you're going to do? You think you're going to build these walls and you know, ridicule can be so discouraging. It's obvious they didn't want those walls built. Now here's where we're going to go. Wednesday night we're going to discuss chapter 3. Now, chapter 3 can get a little tedious, but I'm going to show you some really interesting things. And this is where they're actually building the wall in chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, next Sunday morning, we're going to hear from Sanballat and Tobiah again and see what they're going to do to try to undermine Nehemiah and prevent them from building this wall and the tactics that they take to discourage this. And so there's chapter 2. Quite an interesting book, isn't it? Wouldn't you love to have ridden on those scenes and ridden with Nehemiah around the wall that night? See the great work that lay before them, the rubble that had lain there for some of it for 120 years. And the gates burned with fire. And so we're going to put all that back up and rebuild that. Nehemiah is formulating in his mind the plans, just how they're going to get this done and what's going to happen. And the magnitude of the task did not discourage him because the hand of God was with him. And he knew it would be done. Sometimes it takes a good to just sit back and think, what is the task before us? Maybe we ought to just pause and stop and without anybody knowing it, take our own midnight ride. Sit there in the night and think about what task lies before us and how we're going to do it. God's given us a great task. Go ye therefore into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. How do we accomplish that? Maybe we'll sit back and think. How are we doing that in Warren County? We ready to preach the gospel to every creature in Warren County? Well, what about just this part of the county? Every creature this side of Ben Lomond Mountain. What are we going to do to get out and reach them? Well, we can do it. We can do it together because the hand of the Lord is with us. He wants this work done. And so we'll do our part. We'll do what we can to get the gospel to everyone. I know we use the papers and we have gospel meetings, and hopefully we'll be able to have that gospel meeting this year. We'll have a time where we can go out and knock some doors. Invite people to come and know people that we can invite, and we'll do this work together to bring it to pass. Well, that's the second chapter. We'll go into chapter 3 then Wednesday night, and I'm glad that's really a class period. I think that chapter will lend better to a class than to a sermon. If you want to be part of the kingdom of God, in every service we give that opportunity to either about 3 things. If you want to be baptized into Christ, let us know and we'll do that. If you have been neglectful of the Lord's work and want to get back right with God, with a congregation, you can confess that and we'll pray for you. But if there's other reason that you specifically need prayers, it's appropriate then to let that be known, and we can have special prayers for special needs. So if you have a need tonight such as that, you have an opportunity now to come forward as we stand and sing.